Right. So, everybody, thank you for being here today. I really appreciate you joining us on this second Teach Meet. Today, we're going to have Amanda Fleck. So, obviously, the last time we had Jonathan, and we will still put his slides and his presentation on our Seneca Learning page. Same thing will be happening to Amanda's presentation. So Amanda today, she is a science teacher. She's been a science teacher for 21 years, so she has a lot of experience, and she's very interested in language and literacy. I invited her because I've seen her talk in a few research ed conferences, and she's very good and it's very interesting. I'm also a science teacher, so I like science talking. But this is not only for science teachers. I think a lot of what Amanda has to say applies to teachers of all subjects. She does have a CPD course on Seneca. So after this, we will share the link to the CPD course, or if you just go on Seneca, you'll find it. And you can just learn more about what Amanda is saying and all this literacy and language in sciences. So the way this is gonna work, I'm gonna let Amanda start talking, and then we're gonna have a kind of 25, roughly, minute presentation, and then Q&A. And then maybe Amanda gets back to more presentation depending on what kind of topics people talk about. All the questions will be on the chat, so you can see on Zoom on the right side of the screen there is a chat. So during the presentation, feel free to already start chatting and putting down your questions, and then once Amanda's done speaking, she will read those questions and answer them. All right. Just so you know, I have muted everybody but Amanda and me because we have 500 people and it would be just chaos if we could hear everybody's speaker. So if you have a question, just type on the chat. People are already chatting, that's great. So yes, there will be additional information provided at the end. We will be sharing all the recording and the slides. And yeah, people are excited and that's great. So let's start with Amanda, please.
Hello, everyone. What am I doing here? Yep, that's right. As Flavia says, can we hear me? Everybody hear me? Yeah, we all right there? Yeah, brilliant. I'm interested in literacy and language. I've been teaching a very long while. I'm just going to start my presentation that will be up on, I'll pin it to my tweet as well, but I think it's going up with on Seneca as well. So first thing, I'm going to talk about literacy and language and science. My primary area of interest is vocabulary. So I love science words and I'm obsessed with science words and language in general. So I think the first thing is we've got to define the difference between literacy and language, what they actually mean. Language development involves the development of skills used to communicate with each other through languages. English, Spanish, French, British Sign Languages. It's how you communicate, not necessarily just through speech, generally through speech, but also through sign language. I watched a fascinating YouTube video on that yesterday. However, literacy development involves the ability to read and write. So in schools, we often talk, when we're talking about language and literacy, we often say we have literacy coordinators, but we don't necessarily focus on the language. And I'm really interested in the language because they work together, but it underpins the literacy. Without the language, we can't have the literacy. So I think we have to be careful not to miss out the language. I think one of my favourite things, one of my favourite quotes is one by Neil Postman, and it says, "Biology is not plants and animals, it's language about plants and animals. Astronomy is not planets and stars, it's a way of talking about planets and stars." And I think we have to remember that without the language, without the words, without the vocabulary, we wouldn't be able to do science, we wouldn't have a knowledge of science. And there's a lovely video by Dan Willingham, and I think it's on the Seneca course that I did. I will tweet out a link for it as well, about how reading and knowledge are intertwined. Without the knowledge, you can't read because you don't have the knowledge of the words. So What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through my different aspects. I was really fortunate last year to be asked to be part of the Education Endowment Fund's panel for secondary literacy. And this has informed a lot of my practice as well. And I think what it's done, if you haven't seen it, it will be on my presentation. What it's done is it's enabled people to talk in subjects more about literacy and language. Because what's happening is I think sometimes as science teachers, not everybody, we feel that literacy is done to us. We're expected to do literacy, we're expected to do numeracy, we're expected to do cross-curricular, and we're told we have to do all of these things when it becomes quite complex, and it's just been seen as an add-on. But I think especially for science teachers, it is a very, very word-rich subject. And I think what we need to realise is that that's important. So the Education Endowment Fund did this report on secondary literacy and language, and I was the only sort of non-English teacher, non-history teacher, non-humanities teacher there, and they were all professors, and you know, it's one of those imposter syndrome situations. However, I think it's really, really important that the individual subjects have a voice on this, because we don't want literacy to be done to us. And I think what it's allowed is this disciplinary literacy is about looking at literacy and language through the lens of your subject, and I think that's really vitally important. I'm probably going to look at the first three strands. It goes through vocabulary, reading and writing, but we haven't got time to do them all. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start talking about vocabulary, why vocabulary is important. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. I'll do a presentation for, like I said, about 20 minutes. So why does language matter in science education? So this is our vocabulary. Why does it matter? Oops, the presentation's not working. There we go. There is you've heard of the word gap. There is a 30 million word gap between children from the wealthiest and the poorest families. And there's links, there's hyperlinks to everything I've done, so you can go back to the original research. The word gap is evident from children from 18 months old. So by the time they start school, there's already a gap. And the OUP did some research, and what they found is 60% of teachers at secondary school said that if students came in at year 7 with this gap, then they still had the same gap or an even larger gap by the time they got to year 11. And I think this links to the Matthew effect, which is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So the better your vocabulary is, the better your literacy is, your writing about that, the better that is, then actually you're going to improve faster. And I think we've all seen this. Science tends to be a subject that there are sets in the UK. And so you'll find that your students who have better literacy will make more progress, who have a better vocabulary will make more progress. And I think we've probably all seen something like that. And I think there's varying reasons for that. I'm not really sure why. I have my own views, not based in research, just purely anecdotal. So there's another report from the Education Endowment Fund, which is socioeconomic status and the word gap. And I asked my team at school to read through this. It's quite heavy text, but I think it's really, really important. And one of the areas that they highlighted was that children from lower income families and those who have English as an additional language in general have a larger word gap. And I think there's many reasons for that. I mean, personally, I'd say, this is my take on it. If you are lower income families, you may have to work more, you may not have time. I'm not saying that lower income families don't read with the children, don't speak with the children. It's about circumstances. English is an additional language. If you want your children to be able to speak your home language, so you speak that at home so that it become bilingual and fluent in both languages. But obviously that affects the sort of language that you get exposed to, which the sort of the wider vocabulary you're exposed to is generally from reading as well. But the evidence in this report from correlation studies showed that the strongest predictor is actually how literate a student was. And I found this a little bit shocking, because I'd always imagined, being a science teacher, that maths was more of an indicator of how well students could do. And I know I've worked in schools where students have been set in English, and set in English, set in maths, set in science. And what you'd often find is the students who are good at maths are the students who really like science as well. But it's how literate they are. So when you think about it, that makes perfect sense. Our sort of attainment in science is judged by how well we can write about science. Not how well we can speak about science, not how well we can do practicals, how well we can write about science. The more literate you are, the better you're going to do. And there's a link there to that. So moving on from that and thinking about the words in science. Vocabulary in science is absolutely huge. You just think about how many per lesson, how many per topic, how many per year, how many per term, how many per key stage. You only have to look at science books and look at the glossary at the back. I mean, we've got a really good resource from one of the publishers, and it has all of the keywords. So I printed these out for my year 11, and we've got a wedge about this big. So it's huge, huge, huge numbers. I haven't counted them, but huge numbers. And it's not just about learning the definitions, it's about understanding how they interact together. So for example, this is the photosynthesis topic. I teach this in year 10, and there are 68 keywords. 68 keywords that students need to know. Never mind understanding the conceptual links, understanding the theory, understanding the processes. These are just the words. And without these words, they can't communicate about these topics. And if you look at some of them, transpiration, translocation, these are often polysyllabic words, which are the harder words to learn. And even the meanings and definitions can be quite tricky. And I think we need a health warning. You can give these to students, but how are we using them? And just because a student knows a definition does not mean to say they understand the topic. And I think we've got to be careful about it. So anecdotally, I spoke to a modern foreign languages teacher friend of mine, and we were discussing how many words, I may have got this wrong, we're discussing how many words that you have, for example, in a topic in French or Spanish, and probably a similar number of words, a similar volume of vocabulary that you need to know. And that's what you're focusing on, vocabulary and pulling the sentences together. However, I think in science, we've got that, but we've also got complex processes as well that go along with that. So it makes it even harder to learn. And due to the fact that we have many polysyllabic words in science, they're actually really quite tricky to read as well. So I think this has become much more popular lately about tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 words. I didn't really know much about this until a few years ago. And this is from, we've got the book here, Bringing Words to Life, by Beck, McCown and Kukan. And it talks about language. So tier 1 language is predominantly what students speak and what the population speaks. And it's words that students will know coming into school. Tier 2 is words that may frequently appear in text, but not often speech, and there's similar words that are found across a variety of domains, words that we may use in speech, but quite often we see written down. And tier 3 is the vocabulary of the words that they're associated with a specific domain, or subject-specific keywords, geography. You know, we've got words, for example, I think about geography, precipitation. So we talk about precipitation in science, but we also talk about precipitation in geography. You know, they can have similar meanings, but actually in science, precipitation means something specific. In precipitate, it means a solid that is, precipitated when you, react to liquids or those sorts of things. Or in geography, you talk about precipitation as rain. So I think it's about us as science teachers pointing out that these exist, but they might be different. So a couple of examples of this. I was not Googling the availability of toilet roll in times of the pandemic here. This was for a lesson that I was doing on tissues, and I wanted some images. And I don't know why I was surprised. And we'd say the word is obviously tissue. And we would say tissue probably was a tier 1 word. But actually in science, it's tier 3 vocabulary. So we need to think about those things. So students will have heard tissue. It won't be something like translocation or something like endothermic that they might not have heard of. They will have that in their lexicon. They will have that built into their schema. They will know that word. However, they will not necessarily know the context of that word within science. So it's about, I think, sort of pointing this out to students that's going to be the challenge for them. Don't worry if you don't know all these words, because this is why it's confusing for you. Another one which is slightly different, again, Googling for images, and this one is weight. And we all know the difficulty is that weight is used in a different way in everyday speech and in everyday life than it is in science. And again, I think we're all pretty good at pointing this out, the difference between mass, the difference between weight, and I think that's what we're pretty good at. But I think there's other words that we need to be really careful of. Another one is power and energy and things like battery. Energy is a particular issue for me because it's a word we use continually. However, do we use it? Do students know the scientific definition? So I did a little experiment with my year 12 biologists, because we were talking, I can't remember what we were discussing. We were discussing I think respiration, I can't remember. I said, what does energy mean? And so I got them to write it down, no talking, and then I got them to look at it, and then I got them to read out. And lots of the definitions were things like, it's the power to do something. It's the power, using words like that. And nobody had a clear definition of energy, the ability to do work. And then that's understanding what work means. And I thought, this is year 12. I've got some of the highest attaining students. I've got students in here who've got 9s in science, and they're 16 and 17 years old, and they can't define energy. So then I asked my year 10s, who were a spiky bunch, and they couldn't define it either. And then I thought, well, in year 7, we teach about energy, and we're teaching stores and pathways and all that kind of new nonsense that I still struggle with. And they can tell us that about the different stores and the different pathways of energy, but they can't even define energy. So we're going wrong here. So I think it's about going back with our students in year 7 and finding these words and knowing these words that are going to be tricky ourselves, so that we can then discuss them with them. So tier 2 and tier 3 words, I think it's about looking at those tier 3 words that perhaps tier 1 or tier 2 vocabulary, to make sure that we know what the issues are. So if you look at this is an example, and things like yield. How can you talk about the yield of an experiment or answer a question in chemistry if you don't know what yield means? I think another one is compare. If we don't understand the meaning of compare or contrast, we're going to struggle. And those of you who are markers and who mark exam papers will know the massive issue that we have with terms describe and explain. How often do we get a describe question where a student is explaining, or an explain question where a student, I think every single examiner's report I've seen for years has mentioned that students don't know the difference between describe and explain. And I know that we're all valiantly discussing that. So I think teachers, science teachers, do really, really well with tier 3 words. But I think the difficulty that we have is maybe that some of the tier 2 words or tier 1 words are actually tier 3 for us. And I think it's about recognising that. So what do we know about the structure of words? And everything I'm speaking about is sort of talking with other teachers. We need to be talking with each other about what these difficulties are. I think a lot of us do this intrinsically. We do it naturally because, you know, we are science teachers, and I think we do this, but I think it's making it a bit more conscious about what we're doing. So the structure of words, I've decoded words for a very long time with students, but I don't necessarily know what that means. And so it's morphology, the study of different parts of a word. We have a prefix which comes at the beginning of the word, things like cyclo meaning ring, poly meaning many, hyper meaning above. We have the root, which is a standalone part of a word, and usually from Greek or from Latin roots, and things like chloros or isos, that sort of thing. I don't know if that's me drawing all over my computer screen, but if it is, I'm sorry. I'm not meaning to do that. And then we've got the suffix which comes at the end of the word, something like ein or een, which is related to hydrocarbons. So I actually talk through this with students so that they've got a better awareness of it, so they've got a better understanding of where they're at with this. I've no idea where all that writing's come from on my screen, but I think it's stuck there. Sorry, people. Photosynthesis. Now, I spent probably the first 17 years of teaching splitting this up into 2 words, photo and synthesis. Photo means light, synthesis means to make, until I realised that it actually breaks down into 3 parts. And when I think about it, I quite like the middle part, which is syn, links to synagogue or symphony, which means coming together. And so the more we do with students on this, the more they will realise and actually understand the language in detail. So this is an example that I give to my biology students. I do it with, predominantly I've done a lot of work with year 12, but I also do it with my year 10 class as well, because they're really interested. So an example of how I use this, I taught biological molecules at the beginning of the term, of the year, and I put lots of words up on the board to do with biological molecules, and then I got them to try and decode them. They absolutely love it. And now when we get a new word, we get our sheets out and we decode them. So what they're doing is, one of the year 12 students said to me at parents' evening, and she's our highest attaining student, she said, well, should I just used to skip over the word? She said, but now what I do is I'll get my sheet out, I'll get my glossary out, and I won't skip over the word anymore. So she's now exposing herself more to that tier 3 vocabulary, and she's actually learning to decode it and break it down herself. And then we come on to etymology. Etymology, I love this as a science teacher. This is an example from Alice Visser. She's a literacy coordinator in a school, I think it's in Oxfordshire, and she did these words of the week. So it's the knowing the origins of a term helps to identify its meaning. And I would say don't force this. I think sometimes we force it a little bit too much, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I love this, and it talks about it in a cross-curricular way, and I think it's really, really great. Again, there's a link on my PowerPoint there. So they're all the basics of how language works. So having the words isn't enough, because if we don't, so we can have the words, but how do we conceptually link them? So often students have a really good vocabulary, and like I said, the health warning comes with the fact that students that they perhaps can understand learning the vocabulary, but it's about how do we link that. Now, it's not about having masses of worksheets with words on, it's about writing a few words up on the board and students then writing them down. I do this on the whiteboard where we'll write words down and then we'll make conceptual links. So we make the conceptual links first. So for example, waste product, oxygen is a waste product of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, glucose is produced. So we'll link these as best we can, or sometimes I do it with images and they get to link the words to this, and then I'll get them to write their own paragraphs. And so they're actually thinking really hard about the links between these words, and they're building it into the schema now. And the schema is the sort of the mental pictures that you've got in your head of the knowledge that you know and how that links together. And so I think this is really, really valuable at getting students to use their language. They use it in a spoken way, and then they get them to write it down. So I think writing it down is quite a challenge for students. And so I think further from that, I think it's about modelling use of scientific language. I've already mentioned that in year 7, I think we should be talking about defining the terms correctly and using correct terminology. There's been a lot of talk about the current pandemic, coronavirus, and the COVID-19, and actually the distinction between them has been quite difficult, I think, and I think it's about being specific about those distinctions. So everybody's been talking about the coronavirus, which is actually the virus that causes the COVID-19, and I think we need to be, with our students, we need to have that same kind of, be explicit with what we're saying. So instead of using the term germs, on TV there's been loads of people talking about germs, it makes me twitch. Because I know if we mark an exam paper, germs is just not going to cut it. They're not going to get the mark. And I think it's actually, we should be using the term pathogen. So instead of using germ and bugs, and I know most of us don't do this, but some teachers will do this in year 7 or with our lowest attaining students, we need to use the correct terminology. So there's a few examples here. This is from a piece of research by Carrier in 2011. So this is the sort of thing, if we said to a student, can you tell me what you did? They did an experiment where they mixed 2 white chemicals with water. We put the smooth powder in the bag along with the crunchy powder, and the bag blew up and got hot. That would be typical of many students, I think we'll agree. And then the teacher might say, we mix baking soda. I'd probably say sodium hydrogen carbonate with calcium chloride and water, resulting in gas, and heat was released. Probably that would be enough for a year 7. However, as we move further, this will be the scientist definition. I actually think we need to get our students speaking like scientists. The combination, again, I would say sodium hydrogen carbonate and calcium chloride is an exothermic reaction with the products of sodium chloride, calcium carbonate, and carbon dioxide. And I think as teachers, we need to insist on this level of language, the way they write it down, using the correct terminology. And I think often students will write that. It doesn't happen quickly, but you need to continually model that sort of thing. So I'm going to break in a couple of minutes for some questions. Pronunciation. Now, I live in London, and as you'll notice, I don't have a London accent, and this can cause a little bit of confusion with my students. And I think we need to be careful about how we pronounce words. Nothing wrong with an accent, but I have had generations of students that I've taught saying chloroplast, where their peers and contemporaries may say chloroplast. So it's about sort of highlighting that there is different ways, there are different accents, but pronunciation, that students can overcome this. Again, another example is with a group of students who were asked to, high attaining students with very good vocabulary, were asked to do some research on enzymes in the home and enzymes in industry, how we'd be doing a topic on enzymes. And they did the research, and then I got them to feedback verbally. And they were really struggling with the pronunciation and the names of the enzymes. This was one of them, phosphofructokinase. And they were mumbling. They were telling me all these exciting things that they'd learned, and then they were mumbling over the name of the word. And so we had to go back, and I said, it's really important that if you don't understand the word or you don't know how to pronounce it, that what you do is break it down into its constituent parts. So we looked at breaking the word down, fructokinase, just breaking it down. And I said, if you're struggling with that, try and write yourself a version where it's just you're just using the phonics. And I told them all about what phonics were and the sounds and that sort of thing, where you're just using that, where you're breaking down the words and you're saying it as you see it. And they got a lot more confidence. So the next time we did some research, they had a little bit of time for any words that they didn't know to write them down and to do this, because students will use other words if they don't know how to spell it and they don't know how to say it. And I really don't, and that's not building their vocabulary. Another one of my favourite quotes, science educators are to also some extent language teachers, and the learning of science is like learning a whole new language. And I think this is absolutely true, especially for biology. You need to have students, we need to build students and teachers that are fluent in the language of science. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here, and anybody got any questions that we can answer? I'm going to put the specs on now so I can read these.
So Amanda,
yes,
thank you very much. That was really, really good. I definitely enjoyed it. There have been some questions while you were speaking, so I wrote them down so you don't have to scroll up on the chat. So right in the beginning, there were a lot of people that were still a bit confused on what the 30 million word gap means. Can you expand on that a little bit? What does that mean exactly?
It's the gap between, it's the gap between students who have so what it means is that there is a gap between students when they start at school. There is a 30 million word gap, and that means that they don't have the same vocabulary. So they don't have the vocabulary to access education in the same way. And that comes from reading. A lot of our word hoard comes from reading. And so students from the lowest socioeconomic groups and poorer backgrounds have less of this word hoard. And like I said, that's for a variety of reasons, and the research actually goes into that. And what that means is when they get to school, they don't have the vocabulary, the sort of technical vocabulary, even the vocabulary to be involved in speech, or have the confidence to speak about things. And I don't know how other people feel. We've all felt that, haven't we? I think that Flavia and I were talking about academic text with beautiful language in it that perhaps puts us off slightly. So it's the word hoard that students have access to, the words that they know. And the difficulty is that like I said with the Matthew effect, the less you know, the less you can understand about what you're reading, and therefore you fall further behind.
Yeah. Okay. Great. If anybody has more, they're asking if it's unique words. It's like 30 million. There are a lot of questions asking if it's 30 million unique words.
It's just the word hoard. It's the words that they have. It's the words that students have.
Okay, cool. Other questions, a lot of questions about kids with special educational needs. Is there anything different that we should be doing with them, or just whatever we do?
I think focus on the vocabulary. I mean, I think students with, I talk about this later. There's a book that I've read, and I put about students reading. If students have got a cognitive difficulty with reading, they're going to struggle with the language that they can access science with, and and what that means, that it's a book by, who is it, Diane and James Murphy, and it's called Thinking Reading, I think, if I remember rightly. I think it's called Thinking Reading, and it talks about students not being able to access, thinking reading, students not being able to access the language. And I think SEN students who struggle to read will struggle to access the language. And I think it's really more important. We've all had those students. I remember an individual student, it's called Sean, and I taught him in year 7, and he was the most enthusiastic student about science. His literacy was really, really poor. And I taught him again in year 9, and he wasn't as enthusiastic about science. And then I taught him again in year 11.
Yeah.
And he was, and I think it's a common theme, and we've all seen it. So students with SEN, it's about making sure that they've got a good grasp of the language, get them to talk about it, but don't dumb it down into simpler language. Maybe you need to reframe the text and look at the vocabulary and simplify the words. But what we've got to do, if it's SEN and it's a reading difficulty and a conceptual difficulty or a memory issue, it's about exposing students again and again and again to that language. And maybe it's about, in an ideal world, we'd teach fewer concepts really, really well. So maybe it's looking at the basic concepts and teaching them really well rather than trying to cover everything. I mean, I don't think it's that easy, because it depends what SEN you mean. But I think having the basic vocabulary and being able to speak about it is probably the most vital thing, and so they really understand a topic well.
Okay. Very good. There are some questions about, it's a bit more specific, about kids that come from a bilingual background.
Oh.
Or, okay, Nick, can you not share your screen, please? I don't know how to stop that.
Oh,
okay, there he is. Thank you. Sorry.
Right, sorry. A bilingual. Well,
yeah, and also, so 2 questions in the same. Kids from bilingual background, or the English is not their native language. And somebody asked about kids that come from a poorer Black background, and they say, I don't talk clever like that. Like, that's not how we talk.
I think that's the issue, isn't it? It's about that academic language. Now, students from EAL, so with English not as English as a second language, we have no capacity for learning languages. People know that. You can learn, I mean, and I think it's amazing. I've got kids in my classes who speak 3-4 languages. It's amazing. And I think, I'm here, I'm actually learning Spanish at the moment, badly. But and I'm just grasping the words, I'm a nearly 50-year-old woman learning. It's quite difficult. Students, from what I know, I'm not an expert, from what I know is that students who are bilingual will, it's not really much of an issue for them, but the issue comes from the language you speak at home that you may not have access to. And I think it depends. I think EAL teaching, I think we can learn a lot from our EAL teacher colleagues about looking at how they teach sort of beginning learners with sort of images, a bit like the program I'm doing to learn Spanish at the moment. There's lots of images, so using lots of images to grasp the words. And I think that if we teach science as a foreign language, it actually might help a little bit. But EAL learners, they might not be exposed to things at home, and I think it's about us exposing students to that at school, giving them text to read. And I know there's a lot of people, I think there's people on Twitter who are reading books to the students. I went to a Mary Myatt talk at Research Ed in Kent, and she's fabulous. And she said, read to your students. So I will, when we're doing DEAR, we do DEAR once a week, and instead of getting the students to read, I read to the students. I read complex text, and then I talk about the words. And I think if we're not exposed to that at home for whatever reason, then I think it's about us exposing students to that and giving them books to read, recommending books, giving them talks to watch, but actually reading complex text with them. That sort of thing. And I think and the other question, so that was the first one about EAL. What was the next question?
Kids that say, that's just not how we talk in my family, or that's just not how we talk in a
that's fine. I mean, and I think I think I linked to that with the pronunciation. We've got different accents, we use colloquial language, but this is how we speak about science. And that's what I said, this is how we speak about science, so it gives you a better understanding of science and a better knowledge of science.
Great.
Anything else?
Yeah, there are several.
I think I can see one here. I think it
Yeah,
says,
go
how
for
do
it.
you develop balancing? Is it balancing teaching vocabulary with actually teaching the science?
So it
I
says,
think
how do
it's
we balance developing literacy, reading to students, etc., and covering the content?
everything.
Yeah.
I think it's about, for me, it's about CPD, and I'll talk about that a bit later. It's about CPD of our teachers, so that at every opportunity they know that teachers know actually there's an opportunity here. I get people who ask me, have you got a tier 2 language list? Have you got a tier 3 language list? Have you got a tier 1 language list for science? I go, have you got worksheets for this? No, I haven't. The best resource we have is that teacher in the classroom, the expert in the classroom. And if the teacher doesn't know, then how on earth can we, and I think it's about making us aware of, this is the topic that I'm teaching, this is how I need to teach it. And then using part of a lesson for, our retrieval practice. We have to have retrieval practice at the beginning of every lesson.
Yeah.
Put the words in, keep going back. What does that word mean? Like I said, don't go from year 7 where you do your energy topic and then your energy in year 9 and year 10, and then start talking about energy again in year 12 and you can't even define the term energy. Every time you use some of these things, you have to define it. Students who still, who are answering questions in my year 11, still getting photosynthesis and respiration confused. And that's vocabulary. It's not necessarily understanding, it's the basic vocabulary. So when you've got that basic vocabulary, you have to repeat it again and again and again and again and again. And I completely understand about the issues with teaching it all. It's not possible. It's not possible. We could teach science as a foreign language and that's all we do, teach vocabulary. So you can't fit it all in, we know that. But I think it's about us as teachers just doing the best that we can. But I'm not an expert, so.
That's right. So I think following up on that, there were some questions about the differences between the different key stages. So if you're teaching key stage 3 or A levels, is there different strategies, different techniques that you use? Also, somebody mentioned that sometimes a term in science in the key stage 3 curriculum is meant to be something, and then when you get older kid, it's meant to be something else because it gets more detailed. So how do you deal with that?
Oh, I think that's talking about modeling language. And I think if we talk about I know that A-level students who do chemistry hate this, for example, that you go to do your A-levels, and I've heard this said, whatever you've learned at GCSE, it's not right, this is what the right model is. And I think that's what we've got to be careful of, because it really annoys students. And so I think I actually tell them, I'll say to them, and this is, I talk to my students all the time about this. You might not know this language now, but it's really important that you have it. And I'll explain the way I'm explaining now. So it's a model that we use for the understanding of that student at that time. It's not incorrect, but in key stage 3 you will have learned this. Now in key stage 4 I'm going to add a little bit more detail to give you a better understanding. And at key stage 5 you learned this is what you learned, this is the I don't know, the knowledge or the words that you learned or the definition. And now in year 12 I'm going to tell you, I'm going to add to that, and this is the reason that we did it. And I think students really appreciate that, and it's that kind of metacognition of actually, so they will understand that. I think that's really important. And as long as we tell them, this is the reason that we do it, but I think we've got to be really clear. And I think we've got to look at the definitions that we have and say, does that fit my purposes as a teacher? And what do I need to say? I wouldn't tell a year 7 that it was called a germ. I would tell a year 7 that some people call it a germ and where germ comes from with germ theory, but we're not going to use that because the correct term is a pathogen, a microorganism that causes a disease. Then we'd look at micro and we'd look at organism and what does that mean? And then we'd make sure that if a question was asked about a virus, we'd say, well, on the TV, we're talking about the virus. A virus isn't actually a living thing. Why? Because it can't do the 7 life processes. So I think it's all about building continually around that.
Yep. Great. There are several questions about more practical advice. What kind of strategies do you use? How do you encourage students to read more or to read more about science? How effective are different activities? How really can you close the gap?
I think closing the gap is that we've got to close the gap by giving students the access that their peers would have who had it. So I think it is about reading. Like I said, I'm reading Bill Bryson's The Body to the students at the moment, because it's fascinating. And I also read excerpts from his brief history of nearly everything. And I think it's getting it, even if they're just listening to that, you can get these things on Audible. If they're not reading it, if they're listening to those things, sure, you know, for homework, give them access to it. In school, give them access to it. Encourage, I don't know, with our literacy coordinator, encourage taking the students to the library and finding non-fiction books on science, because there's a lot of small children are fascinated. You know, tell me how many, I don't know how many young 5-year-olds know every animals. You know, my son was obsessed with dinosaurs. You know, he could tell you everything about them, the morphology, the, you know, the sort of physiology, what the, you know, and he had that knowledge because he was interested. And I think it's about harnessing that. Children are intrinsically interested in science, but we lose that interest because it's complex. And I think and what we've got to remember is reading about science is complex. I mean, on the presentation, I go further to talk about students' ability to read. So I think, can I just do a little bit about the students' ability to read?
Of course.
So I'm going to share the screen again and just go about students' ability to read, what the issues are there. So we've said it's like a foreign language, and there we go. And how do students learn to read? I ask this question a lot, and overwhelmingly, so I'll have an audience of teachers, and I'll ask them, how do children learn to read? Now I've got adult children, and my children learn to read by actually using whole words, but children now learn to read by phonics, and overwhelmingly the people who tell me that are people with small children, unless you've done some self-study or you've learned to be a primary school teacher. Most secondary school science teachers I speak to, nobody's taught them how children learn to read, which baffles me. You know, anybody out there who's doing teacher training, please can we have that on the curriculum? I don't know. So children learn by phonics, and we won't even know that we're doing this. And this is why I think primary teachers are incredible. So any of you out there who are primary teachers, you are amazing people, because you teach children who have the ability to speak. You teach them how to read and write about that, and I think that's incredible. So we've got phonemes, which are the smallest units of the sound. Things like there are 44 phonemes in the English language. So that you've got your k's and your o's, those are your phonemes, and there's 44 in the English language. You can see at the bottom of the screen, you've got these little things, the little diagram there. And then we've got a grapheme, and that's a way of writing it down. So writing it down, the English language is complex. And we, I forgot to mention this, Bill Bryson, I think it's English language, I can't remember, it's about the history of English language, and he talks about the history of how English language developed, and now some of it was really strange, and somebody decided they wanted to change it, so they just did. So that's why we've got complex and weird graphemes in English. And then we've got to decode a word, and we've got to encode a word. So decoding a word is how to read a word, and I think students are really, really good at that. And encoding a word, how to spell it, not so easy, due to the fact that some of the graphemes can be quite complex. You know, your 2 letters and your 3-letter groups. So you've got your O, G, H for uff and that sort of thing. So that's what phonics are, and that's how children learn to read. And they taught that up until about the age of 7, as far as if my knowledge is correct. But after that, we don't really teach reading as much. And if you don't understand it then, you're going to struggle. And I see students who come in year 7 and in year 11, they're still struggling. And an example that I give often is my brother, who is he's nearly 60. He's 9 years older than me, he's nearly 60. And he couldn't read, he couldn't access reading very well. So in the 70s, when he was struggling to read, they actually put him on lessons for half a day a week. He was taken away and he was taught to read. So before he left primary school, he was taught to read. And I think our primary colleagues do an amazing job, but we are still getting students who are accessing a full curriculum who still cannot read. I teach a girl who's got a few girls who've got really, really low reading ages. Verbally, they're excellent, but they just not grasp the basics of reading, and that leads to frustration. And I think that there is something to be said. And in the Thinking Reading, Diane Murphy and James Murphy have written some really good ideas for whole school issues with reading. And it means that really, really specific intervention. You can't access any of the curriculum if you can't read. So how do they learn fluency? Lots of students can get visual recall, but they're not at fluency. And some of those students that we deal with that are really struggling to read haven't got to fluency. So they decode and then they'll visually see a word. And then it becomes fluency and it becomes automatic. Different reading sort of different, students will struggle if they read very slowly, and we know that students are penalised in exams if they read really slowly because it takes a long while to read an exam paper. Science papers have a lot of words in them. We almost have as many as an English literature paper. Compared to something like maybe, I don't know, a history paper where most of it is the student doing the work. There's a lot of questions in science. So if you are a slow reader, you'll be penalised. You will not be able to maybe answer all of the questions. I've got some really high attaining girls who really struggle to finish the paper on time. So it's that fluency in reading, and maybe there's things that we can do there. Now, if we imagine that science is a foreign language and that we are treating it as a foreign language, there are some studies, I've seen this 95%, that students need to understand 95% of written text to make meaning from it. Now, I can't find it anywhere apart from in second language learners. But if we're saying science is like a second language, then that means they have to understand quite a lot of text before they can make meaning from it. So I think making sure that we've got the vocabulary so they can understand it will mean that they've got a better, that they can understand the text, because science text is really complex. And I think that's what we really need to think about. And I'm just going to talk about very quickly now before we finish. There are other things to talk about here on the presentation, but I'm going to leave it after this part that I've spoken about. So this is the Flesch-Kincaid score, and it's an American scoring system, and it looks at how difficult text is to read. Science text is difficult to read. There's nothing we can do about it. Exam papers in science are difficult to read, and that's due to the nature of the language. So the higher the score on the Flesch-Kincaid, you can get this on Word as well quite easily. The higher the score, the easier it is to read. So science texts tend to be difficult to read. This is a year 7 book, and I did Flesch-Kincaid score on this, and this is 71. So it's plain English, 13 to 14, 14 to 15, and this is for 11 and 12-year-olds. So science text is difficult. This is a typical page from a textbook. So how many of your students perhaps don't have the reading age the same as the chronological age? So they're going to struggle with this text, and this is where we need to help them as teachers. So it's difficult to read, and the reason science is difficult to read is because of the polysyllabic words and also the complex sentences. So publishers try and get around this by shortening the words, but then you lose meaning. So there's nothing we can do about it. We can't simplify text, and we can't make it easier because science is complex. This is another one. This is hormones in the menstrual cycle. I teach this at year 10, and this is the age at 15 to 16. How many students do you teach that do not have a chronological age, a reading age of 15 to 16, do not have a reading age that matches the chronological age? And I think those are the kind of difficulties that we are dealing with. Right, I'm going to leave it there because we've got about 5 minutes, haven't we, for any follow-up questions. On my PowerPoint, there's other things as well, and like I said, I will tweet that out. So any other questions there?
Yeah, so I want to tell everybody again that Amanda slides are going to be available, and also somebody mentioned that if you click on the more on the chat, you can save the chat. I haven't tried that, but I see a lot of people sharing resources and links, so just save the chat so you can go back to
there which was talking about resources. I'm going to go back up to that one. It was something I can't find it now.
There is just one. There are a few more questions. I think one of them is quite interesting, actually. Several of them together. How important is it to have a whole department school approach to teaching vocabulary, or should each department have a literacy keywords lead? How does that organize with the school structure?
Right. I think if you're interested in that, look at the EEF report from 2019. Again, there's a link on my PowerPoint, because I think what it means is that the literacy and language should be within the disciplines, because we've all done this, and I think this is probably what I'm trying to get the message across about. It's why I'm interested in science in particular, because if we don't put it within our subjects and we don't take ownership of it as a team, as a department, then it's just another add-on, and it shouldn't be an add-on, because what we need is really robust CPD for our teachers on what language, because the medium of teaching is in the language. You know, you can't have a good scientist without a good vocabulary, without a good knowledge of the words, of the language. You can't have somebody, a good scientist, if they can't read and write about it. So I think for me, it has to be within departments, within a whole school. And I think why I love this report and why I like being on that panel is because I could say, well, science teachers don't work like that. We like short sentences. We don't like things to be overly complex. We want it simple. You know, we don't want to write stories about these things because it becomes an add-on. And we've all done that in literacy. I've done that, you know, your PE paragraphs, modelling what they do in English. It isn't the same. And I think that it's about this disciplinary literacy, which means that we've got that departments take ownership of this. What does it mean to us and what do we need to do? And so the best whole school approach is actually then look at it through the lens of the subjects. And we do those layers. And I think that would be, for me, the best way forward.
Okay, fantastic. Let me ask you one more question before we can finish. People have been, well, two, if you wanna. One of them is about dual coding. Do you think using images help with teaching vocabulary?
Yeah, I'm learning Spanish at the moment, as I've said, and my head is full of vocabulary, and the images definitely help. And I think the dual coding with the images, you know, we don't always do this, and sometimes it's simple, sometimes it's not. And I think having those images really, really helps, whether it's a sketch you've drawn, whether it's a not Duolingo, whoever's asking, it's another one. And I think that and I think that's really important. But if we just did that, that's all we would do. So what I'm saying is, the more we know, the better we are at stopping our lessons and saying, oh, this is, and actually knowing and identifying. It's like the pre-mortem. You start a topic and you have a look. Where is the difficulty in language going to come from this topic? How does that link to what they've done in year 7? How does that link to what they've done in primary? Where's the misconceptions and the confusion? And so it's just like good teaching is, but we're looking at it through the lens of language, and that's the medium that we teach in. So we need to make sure we're getting that right.
Okay, amazing. Very final question. Do you have any books or podcasts or articles for people who want to start reading about that?
Yes, I've got, on my presentation, there are lots of books. I will just read a few. This is my very favourite book. It's really old. Anybody who's been around a long time like me, it's a really old book, Literacy and Language. Also, the National Strategies, Key Stage 3 from the 90s and the 2000s has got a lot of information on it. This is the only one I can actually find just about science education. It's a bit old now. And if you're out there, Jerry Wellington and Jonathan Osborne, at some point, please write a new one. Bringing Words to Life. It's American, but it's fantastic. Other people have stolen a couple of my other books that I don't have. Alex Quigley's Mind the Vocabulary Gap is absolutely superb and really, really easy to read. And it's no surprise that he's actually, a lot of his examples of these complex words are science terms. And also there is something from the OUP. There's lots and lots that I've got on the end of my presentation, which I will be putting on Twitter, and we will be sharing on Seneca as well. Yes. Oh, and Alex Quigley's got his new book out, Mind the Reading Gap.
Great. So yeah, a lot of people asking about Twitter. We will be sharing this on Twitter, but we'll also have a specific page on Seneca Learning only for those teach meets. So we're creating a YouTube channel to share the recordings.
Oh, good grief.
And we will have the slides and the PowerPoint presentations on a page on Seneca Learning. So even if you're not on Twitter, it doesn't matter, just go on Seneca. First things, do Amanda's CPD course, because you'll learn a lot more about that. And 2, just wait until we have this page and then you can access everything back again. Right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. I mean, everybody's loving it. I loved it. So thank you very much. And can you tell people your email and your Twitter handle, please, if they want to get in touch with you?
Yep. My email is amandafleck01@gmail.com. I'll put it on the chat quickly. amandafleck01@gmail.com. And my email is @AJTF71. That's @AJTF71.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining, and we're gonna have another one next Wednesday. We already have Gemma Singleton.
Oh, Gemma, lovely.
Yeah, talking about retrieval strategies. We have Kate Stockings talking about the curriculum in Key Stage 3. We have Michael Childs talking about his new book, Craft. and all the strategies that come with it. Yeah, lots of people scheduled, so we will announce the next one soon.